best friends forever. Her name was Stephanie, and she lived in a high-risk psych ward. She sat in her near-blank cell in the high-risk unit, looking disheveled. Her bloodshot eyes stared through her messy blonde hair at the small window in her wall. Even 2 years later, she could still hear the whispers coming from outside. She couldn't distinguish a single one, but knew Alina was still in trouble. Even after all this time, she was still in trouble. As the main doors to the branching halls of the high-risk unit opened, Stephanie gripped her hair in anger when she heard her doctor giving another speech to yet another touring medical class, and she pressed her hands against her ears as her story began to ruminate again. Now, this next patient of mine is one of the most interesting and perplexing cases of psychotic delusions I've come across. Consistent reality divisions with accelerating instability. This instability has ranged from physical defiance, threatening caretakers, attacking staff, and repeated escape attempts. However, despite therapy during each delusional episode separately, her story has remained invariant through every one of them. She claims that last year, upon a spur-of-the-moment decision, she decided to take a cross-country road trip. In August 2017, Stephanie Bordeaux and her best friend Lena Green borrowed her brother's old El Camino and began a trip from Detroit to Santa Fe. Stephanie had scarcely done things in her life without careful planning, but after packing up most of what she had, Stephanie began to get excited at the prospect of free, spirit traveling. Elena took the first driving shift, and both agreed to switch off when they got to Chicago. On the way, Elena talked about feeling very nervous about seeing her parents again after many years away from Santa Fe. They left on a sour note, and Elena said she told them both in so many words to burn in hell, and went no contact before they could respond. She'd never been this anxious before. Don't worry, Elena. Everything will work out if you learn to relax a little. Elena sighed in slight annoyance. Why is that always your go-to solution? Stephanie looked at her with a mix of pity and confusion. I guess maybe because things never really turn out the way you imagine them. When Elena had finished venting, Stephanie explained her own story and why she had a habit of planning for her future so carefully. She spoke of how the last thing she said to her parents was that she never needed them, and how the world has taught her, a kid, more than they did with their own life experience. Stephanie lamented the act and said she wanted to see them again, but no longer knew where they lived. She didn't even know of anyone who could contact them for her. I swear, Elena, if it weren't for you, I'd be completely alone. I know you would let me if I asked, but you always stay here. Oh, don't worry, I plan on vanishing the first chance I get. Seriously, what else are best friends for, dummy? Elena said with a chortle. Food and money. Stephanie shot back. Heh, you woo say I loved you that much. But for real, get some sleep. I don't want you dozzing at the wheel when it's your turn. They each felt a little more relaxed now, and Stephanie tried to take advantage of the lull to nap. She had no idea how long she was out, but she was woken up in shock when Elena slammed on the brakes. What happened? She asked, panicked. Are we okay? Was there a deer? Elena didn't answer. It was almost 4 a.m. and she had stopped near instantly without pulling over to look into the distance. Stephanie tapped Elena on the shoulder a few times, each harder than the last. What's up? You okay? She asked. You can't be for real, Steph? You don't hear that. Hear what? My brake pads? No, someone was calling my name, Elena. First of all, it's like 20 miles to the next gas station, let alone the next town. There's no way anyone is out there. Second, even if there were, you wouldn't be able to hear it over the wind over there. There's also not a single howl. Dude, shut up. I'm trying to listen. Stephanie became unnerved. She had never seen Elena this fixated, especially in such a precarious position. Stephanie finally convinced her to at least pull over. Without hesitation, Elena opened the car door and started walking down the roadside hill of overgrown grass and through the connecting wheat fields that led to a group of trees on the horizon. Elena! What the fuck are you doing? It's 40 bows out here. Elena didn't look back as she responded. Just Jim a minute, okay? That voice sounds familiar. I just want to check it out. Stephanie grabbed the keys as she left the car and began jogging after Elena. By the time Stephanie had caught up with her, they were both entering the small patch of forest they had seen from the car. It was a very strange place. When they both entered, it was almost as if it began to die off with their progression. There were utterly red trees and even ones without leaves entirely. Elena, what are you? In the middle of the confusion of the forest layout, she noticed a small lake, and Elena was headed straight for it. Before she could say anything, there was a whisper. Suddenly, Elena stopped being the focus when Stephanie began to hear more whispers. They eventually grew into faint voices that sounded familiar in tone. Voices that sounded like they were worried about her. She shook it off and began to refocus her attention on Elena, who was now ankle deep in the water. Stephanie continued to jog towards her, but began to notice silhouetted objects in the water. Elena had stopped walking and started trembling, staring into the water. When Stephanie returned her gaze to Elena, thick bushes and branches had inexplicably appeared in her way. She fought through them and called out for Elena to come back. As Elena stared into the lake, she panicked until she became hysterical. She screamed, "Hey, Steve Hanaloy, UVTOLP Rastuetm." Elena charged into the water like her life depended on it, and Stephanie saw her briefly resurface as she began to dive deeper. When she reached the lake, Stephanie noticed the silhouetted figures had become more apparent. They were bodies ranging from older teens to the elderly, and found the whispers were coming from each one of them. Stephanie was almost trance, like when she looked at each one's face. They all seemed significantly familiar, and the thought became so powerful that she vaguely recognized features on some of the bodies. One reminded her of her old babysitter, another of an old neighbor. Endless amounts of former classmates, even a barista from years ago she shared a single laugh with over having the same name. She thought of her old teachers, and despite all the bodies being in or approaching adulthood, she even thought of friends she swore she made in elementary school. The more she saw of these corpses, the more of them floated to the top, and the foggier her memory became. She had become so affected that she realized she had forgotten about Elena for a few minutes. She ran into the lake and leaped like Elena, diving into the frigid water. Elena was so far down in the lake that Stephanie noticed more corpses surrounding her. The deeper she went, even more began rising. Each one floated by, looking familiar enough to stop and examine, though she resisted the urge to do so when she finally saw Elena again. Elena desperately grabbed the bodies floating up from the void of the bottomless lake and tried to use her feet to swim up, but it was pointless when carrying them. On instinct, Stephanie yelled and reached out for Elena's hand when Elena began looking up and screaming out every last breath of air in her lungs. She began to sink into the void as the number of floating bodies became so countless that they raised Stephanie to the surface. Stephanie was pushed out of the lake, now thoroughly drenched, freezing, and covered in blood from the bodies at the surface. She screamed as loud as she could. "Elena, I'm Gumgal P on ASIVO," before bolting back to the El Camino, only to realize everything in her pockets had somehow been lost in the lake. She leaned and eventually sat against the car as hypothermia began to settle in. She had no energy to move or even call out for help. She went in and out of consciousness for an unknown amount of time before the next car, a police patrol vehicle, stopped just in time for the officer to see her faint. And from then I only remember waking up in warm blankets. By now, the rest is institutional history. Stephanie later said to a sheriff's deputy, firmly squeezing her hands together after they refused to take off her handcuffs. "Stephanie, do we really have to go through this again? Do I need to get Dr. McCarthy already?" "There is nothing to go through because for the last fucking time I DINTDOYTING. Stephanie, this isn't helping anyone. If you don't understand, she's still out there. She needs your help. Fucking Dio Samitech. The sheriff's deputy sighed and paged Dr. Carthy, the hospital's head psychiatrist, into the room and let them both be. She had seen him and told him her story more than she could count. "Stephanie, the yelling and screaming aren't helping anyone. So once again, we will start from the beginning until you can calmly listen. Okay." Her hands balled up in so much anger that she couldn't even look at him. The doctor laid several photos on the desk, each face down. "Stephanie, we have checked with your parents, siblings, previous jobs, and even your old school records. You have never been around any woman named Elena Green in your whole life. She then. In all that digging, you would have found out I know Ayer Tyang about her, my best friend. Her favorite game is blackjack, her biggest fear is regret, she wanted to be a psychiatrist, and she was the biggest bookworm I knew. Stephanie, I need you to take a few deep breaths, root yourself in the present, and listen to me. Elena Green was not anybody you knew personally. She was a hitchhiker you picked up. Do you remember this? That's bullshit. We graduated the same fucking year. I remember how much I needed the pep talk she gave me when I walked out in front of the school to grab my diploma. I remember the summer we spent together, and when the riptide pulled it under hard enough to break her arm, I would never have gone across the country alone. I specifically took the person I was closest to, which happened to be her. She's TLTR Hawabu Amen Masta Yael Yi How STFLPR. Stephanie, at this point, I need you to start breathing and stop shouting so you don't pass out. Otherwise, it's another day in this facility, and we'll have to start this process again tomorrow." Dire. McCarthy flipped over several but not all of the pictures. Most were of a bloated corpse, one that looked like it had just floated to the surface of the lake, wounds, mutilations, and all, but several photos also showed it lying on land as if it had washed up on a beach. Do you see what I mean? He asked. There isn't even a lake there. A small sinkhole became a sizable puddle when it was raining that night. Now, I'd like you to look at these last few photos. She wanted to look away as he turned them over. She stared at them, remembering how Alina screamed underwater as Stephanie reached out to help her. The final group of photos were of a closer examination of the crime scene's body. It was Alina, first found face down in the flooded sinkhole, with many more showing Stephanie standing over her, still as a statue and covered in blood. The only corpse in that entire woods is hers. She was someone you picked up on the street. She tried to get away from you, and you chased her down so you could beat and drown her, didn't you? Interviews continued for another few days, but she no longer had anything to contribute, be it words or actions. Stephanie had relived her story for the umpteenth time, now sunk back into her bare bed, and listened to the footsteps of Dr. Carthy and the touring medical class get closer and closer to her room. The top of the door slid upward to reveal a plexiglass window inside her door's lockdown security features. McCarthy pushed her door's intercom button and greeted her. Good morning, Stephanie. How are you feeling today? She felt heavier and heavier with each of the hundreds of livings, but for the first time, she had an epiphany. She looked at McCarthy and spoke for the first time in nearly 2 years. I think I recognize the bodies in the water now.